us. So with that, we'll get started. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight entitled Immigration and the New Class War with our distinguished guest, Michael Lind. Our event tonight is part of a larger spring series at the college on the theme, Who is My Neighbor? Immigration, Freedom, and Community. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm Professor of Religion and Philosophy at St.Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public by exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society. The Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easier, comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, very special thanks, as always, go to the staff of the Institute, Administrative Assistant Shannon Regier, and Assistant Director Greg Seams. None of what you see tonight happens without their energy and diligence. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of Marketing and Communications, and to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the Broadcast Media Services crew for their contributions. Thanks to students who are helping us tonight, Ava Bowman, Ezra Garcia, Gervon Nagumba, and Vilma Rivera for helping us this evening. Finally, thanks to Mike Feuerstein, Professor of the Public Affairs Conversation, and students in the Public Affairs Conversation course who are here with us tonight. We're pleased to be in conversation tonight with Michael Lind. Michael is currently visiting professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. He received his BA and his JD from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA in International Relations from Yale University. He's a co-founder of New America, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., and has been an editor or staff writer for The New Yorker, Harper's, The New Republic, and The National Interest. Michael is the author of a number of important books on American political and economic history and policy. Among them, Made in Texas, George W. Bush and the Southern Takeover of American Politics, published in 2003. The American Way of Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy and the American Way of Life, published in 2006. Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, published in 2012. Most recently, Michael co-authored with Robert D. Atkinson, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business, published in 2018. These books and others Michael has authored have been hailed by reviewers as major contributions to American policy discussions, and the book's contents mark Michael Lind as a remarkably capacious, indeed, in moments, encyclopedic intellect, an erudite historian and acute analyst of a wide range of economic, social, and strategic problems that the United States has faced throughout its history and in our own time. Generally, Michael characterizes himself as, and these are his words in an email to me, a small d democratic nationalist in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, Theodore, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In domestic policy, still his own words, this means support for a mixed economy with protections for workers, not a free market. In foreign policy, it means a realist approach to achieving a peaceful and prosperous world based on great power existence. It means strategic trade in the service of the national industrial base, and immigration in the national interest. Immigration in the national interest. This is actually Michael's second visit to St. Olaf. He was with us as a guest of the Institute in fall of 2016, just before the election of Donald Trump to the presidency, to talk about the presidential election. I think it's fair to say, this is about a month before the election, that all of us were surprised as to what happened there. We're glad to have him with us again. Would you join me in welcoming Michael Lind this time for a conversation about immigration and the new class war?
Well, thanks, Ed. I'd like to thank Professor Santuri and the Institute for Freedom and Community. Uh, I do regret the introduction because you're supposed to lower expectations, so I don't disappoint people. But you may have built them up a little bit, but I hope you won't. But it's great to be back. Uh, Northfield, Minnesota, yay! So had a very wonderful, engaging audience. And I say this as the veteran of many, many audiences in many places. So that's always a pleasure when you have students and community members and other academics like the ones here.
So let's start. Michael, in summer 2017, you published an article in the journal American Affairs, an article entitled "The New Class War." And among other things, you proposed in that essay that American immigration policy should be assessed against the background of this new class war. Now, this new class war wasn't the class war that Marx talked about, that is to say, a war between the owners of the means of production, the capitalists, and the working class. This was a class war, you said, which was a war between a new class, a managerial class, a transnational managerial class, and the working class. What do you mean precisely by class war, this new class war, and what are the implications for the immigration question?
Well, class analysis is rare in ordinary politics because all factions, left, right, and center, want to claim there's no class division, there's good people and bad people, right? Or there's the public interest and the correct conception and the mistaken conceptions. I find it indispensable in understanding American society and societies anywhere in the world. I should say that class analysis, as Marx himself wrote, he said, I was not original with me, said Marx. You know, this goes back to Aristotle and Plato and theories of different classes. The body of thinking that I'm building on in this American Affairs essay, and also in a book based on it, called The New Class War, which will be published by Penguin in the fall, goes back to the middle of the 20th century when James Burnham, who had been the #2 deputy of Trotsky in the United States, the dissident Soviet communist, broke with the communists and the Trotskyites and wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution in 1942 when he said Marx was right about industrialization creating this new class structure. He was wrong about where history is going. He said, and he was very Marxist analysis still. He said, in pre-modern agrarian society, the two big classes were the landlords and the peasants, or the farm workers. They could be slaves, they could be serfs, they could be free, peasants. Industrialism converted most of the peasants into wage earners, the proletarians. Proletariat comes from a Latin word which means somebody without property. You would die if you were not paid wages, right? You're totally dependent on a labor market. Having a majority of wage workers, you only get that in industrial societies, the 19th and 20th centuries. And then the capitalists who had been merchants or smiths, in some cases they were artisans, very low status in medieval society, become the richest people in first Britain and then in the United States and Germany, France. So Marx predicted that the bourgeoisie, the classic capitalist who is the owner-operator of a business and is running it. Think of Ebenezer Scrooge, right? You're running the business and Bob Cratchit is working for you. Eventually, the proletariat, Bob Cratchit, is going to replace Ebenezer Scrooge peacefully or violently, and then the workers will run everything themselves. That had not worked out in the time since the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Now it's almost a century later, and Burnham said, no, what we see happening, and he drew on Gardner and Means, two American scholars, their work on the rise of the manager. you got these enormous corporations like U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar company. Andrew Carnegie technically was the capitalist owner, but he couldn't monitor what all of these hundreds or thousands of workers were doing. So you created this new class of managers who you created business schools, right? You created the MBA, right? You had lawyers, you had marketers, you had all of these managers and professionals running these gigantic corporations in Europe and the US. And Burnham said in the 1940s that their equivalents in other industrial countries are the bureaucrats in the Soviet Union, right? And technically, the working class ran the Soviet Union. He said, no. There's a new ruling class. It consists of the managers, and they're members of the Communist Party. It's what was later called the nomenclatura. It's about, a few percent of the population, but they're the same as the bosses in the United States. He argued that in the so-called capitalist societies, the passive investors depended on the managers, on the CEOs, who did not own the corporations. Right? They might own some stock, but they were essentially employees of General Electric or U.S. Steel or whatever. And in practice, they were the ones making the decisions, not the stock owners necessarily. So he predicted, rather pessimistic book. He said that in different forms, in the U.S., in Europe, in the fascist countries, he wrote this during World War II when fascism was still an option, in the communist countries, which had been around since the Russian Revolution, you're going to get this managerial class come to power. And then the trick is to restrain it. And that's the challenge of democracy in all ruling classes. That is, how does the majority, whether they're peasants in the old days or workers, wage earners in the present, how do they check the power of this elite that is really running things? Now, interestingly enough, John Kenneth Galbraith, great liberal economist, was influenced by Burnham, and that shaped his idea of what he called the technostructure in his book, The New Industrial State in the 1960s, where he made a similar argument. And so it's not entirely original with me. I used the term in my first book, The Next American Nation, overclass. And there was a Newsweek cover story, which kind of got it wrong, because what I mean by overclass is simply managerial professional class. It's people with college degrees, but particularly with advanced degrees, who are about 10, 15% of the population. I belong to it. Many of you in the room, if not most of you, if you have college educated, college students and so on, it's us, right? It's not this 0.001% of billionaires out there. Arguably, we run the country in the sense that you things that go against our interests as college-educated professionals get nowhere politically. And I'll just give you two examples of that. In 2016, Hillary Clinton and I think some of the other Democratic candidates say we need to raise taxes on the rich, but we need to cut taxes on the middle class. And if memory serves, Hillary defined the middle class as $200,000 a year or below. I'm sorry, if your household is $200,000, you're way up there. You're like 97th, 98th percentile. But this professional class is so powerful. You would see letters now and then to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times saying, I'm a dentist, I make $400,000 a year, and my wife is a lawyer. We pull down $800,000. We can hardly pay our bills, right? We're middle class. Who are these people calling us rich? How can you live in New York City on less than $1 million a year, right? So one of my purposes in the article as well as in the book is kind of shock people into thinking it's not the 1% or even the 0.01%. It's the top 10 or 15%. And my interpretation of the populism that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic in the United States that produced Trump and that produced Brexit in Britain and the yellow jacket protesters in France, it's clearly got class dimensions to it. That is, on one side, you tend to have the college-educated professionals who cluster in Europe and America in a fairly small number of big cities, hubs I call them in the book. And then you've got the working classes of all races, and particularly in the United States, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, as of the first decade of the 21st century, are majority suburban now. So the whole idea of urban minority, that was true in the 60s and 70s. It's not true now. So you're seeing this geographic division. And you see this when you look at electoral maps, if you do it at the county level, right? So the red and the blue in the United States, the red being Republicans, the blue being Democrats. The blue is big cities and college towns. The red is kind of everywhere else. It's not really the countryside, because most of the people who vote red kind of live in the outer suburbs of these big metro areas. So geographically, this is the expression of the class division between the college-educated professionals who tend to live in the cities and the working class of all races. Now, there are divisions within the working class on race, on religion, ethnicity, and so on we can talk about. But they're priced out. They don't live in central Paris. They don't live in downtown London. They don't live in midtown Manhattan, right? And that's, so you get these maps are a geographic expression of this class divide.
All right, so now with this class divide, you say that the contemporary, the current problem of immigration, or the debate about immigration policy has to be seen to some degree in light of this class division. I mean, what is the connection exactly?
Well, it has to do with the distributional effects and the costs and benefits. And again, in ordinary politics, if you talk like me, you should not run for office, okay? If you're going to be a politician or an activist, you have to say, there's only the public interest, and then what is good for the whole, the nation state, for America, the world, whatever it is. And then people who disagree are evil or stupid. They simply don't understand what's good, or they're just personally malevolent. So I'm approaching this as an analyst, having spent most of my life in public policy in Washington, D.C. Every policy has winners and losers. There are distributional effects. Generally, the people pushing for the policies are the winners. Now, maybe there are cases of mass delusion where people push for policies that are harmful for them. Usually that gets corrected in time. The people who oppose them, maybe it's a delusion that they just think they're losing and they've been deceived. But in some cases, at the very least, they're not gaining from it. So when it comes to immigration, there are clear class distributional effects. There have been two kind of gold standard reports that almost everybody respects from the National Academy of Sciences, bipartisan academic. One was in 1996, one was in 2016. And they both had pretty much the same conclusion. So immigration, and we're just looking at unskilled immigration right here. We can have a separate conversation about college-educated immigrants. But this is unskilled or low-wage immigration. It generally comes to a couple of conclusions. It increases GDP, gross domestic product, which is just a mathematical certainty, because GDP is calculated by the workforce times productivity. If you expand the workforce, GDP goes up, right? So by definition, all immigration increases GDP. There are different distributional effects. The distributional effects of immigration, according to the National Academy of Sciences, they hurt both natives and previous immigrants with the lowest levels of education. That is high school dropouts and high school graduates, because they're competing with unskilled immigrants for jobs. So it tends to lower their wages. In the first generation, they argue that this changes after the second, third generation. Unskilled immigrants remove more from the welfare state than they pay in taxes, putting into it. So that's the costs. So then the question was, what are the benefits? And there you have to break it down country by country. So it's different in Britain than it is in the United States. It's different in Canada than it is. So in the United States, we have this very polarized immigration system where most countries most Western democracies have a system in which about 2/3 of immigrants are skilled immigrants. They have what is called a point system. You get a point if, for example, Canada, Australia, Britain, they give you points if you speak English. If you have a college diploma, you get points, and so on. So it's about 2/3 based on skills and education. About 1/3 is based on other factors, of which the two most important are family unification. That is, you're related to somebody already in the country, and you reunite the families, or humanitarian, asylees and refugees. The United States, for historical reasons we can get into, as the reverse of that. Going back to the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, we're about 2/3 family unification and about 1/3 other categories. And of the educated workers we have, the majority of them are squeezed in through a non-immigrant visa program, the H-1B program, which you may have heard about, often and through universities. So it's very important on universities, students who come from foreign countries as university students, and then get a sponsor who's an employer for an H-1B. And it's a very exploitative system in as much as it's indentured servitude. Strictly speaking, you're bound to that employer. If you cannot quit without going back to your home country, right? So it's quite different from a point system of the kind that you have, say, in Canada, where if you meet the points, you get a green card. You become what in the U.S. is called a legal permanent resident. If your boss mistreats you, you can quit and then get another job in Canada. That's not the system here that we have for a lot of these highly educated H-1Bs. So we have a very polarized immigration system where, because of family reunification, it benefited chiefly citizens of Latin American descent from Mexico and Central America, who were largely rural, in the same way most of the European immigrants were 100 years ago, nothing new there, and with large families. So you had this rapid expansion of this largely rural, unskilled population through family reunification. Then at the top, much smaller, it's less than 100,000 a year, you have these highly skilled contract workers. And then there's a diversity quota, and there's refugees and asylees and so on. So what you find looking at the polls in both the US and Europe, and this is pretty much true in all industrial democracies, there is no popular backlash against skilled immigrants, right? It tends to be against the less skilled immigrants, where the opponents of that category, whether they're right or wrong, we can debate, they say they're dependent on welfare and they drive down wages at the bottom. And it can take on nasty ethnic nativist overtones in some countries, but it's not necessarily racist. So for example, in Britain, there was a backlash against so-called Polish plumbers, because under the EU's free mobility rules, a lot of Eastern Europeans were coming and competing with low-wage Brits in the lower working class labor market. And they just became known proverbially as the Polish plumber. So it's a mess. It's a mess. You have concerns about economic competition. You get concerns about rapid cultural change, which have always tended to lead to backlashes. There was a huge backlash against German Americans, led by, among others, Benjamin Franklin, back in the 18th century. He thought too many Germans were moving to Philadelphia, and he said they will never assimilate, and they're horrible people, and we should keep them out. So you get these waves of nativist backlash, but the thing is, you can't simply dismiss the backlash against immigration. Yeah, sometimes it's just pure racism and nativism, right? You just don't like those people. But there are differences in the costs and the benefits. And if we have a growing amount of jobs, which the economist David Autor calls wealth work, it's things, mostly big city jobs doing menial services for rich people, right? It's like dog walkers, and spa workers and these kinds of categories. And So you're getting this kind of polarized class system in cities like New York and San Francisco, Los Angeles, even in Austin, where I live, which has now become a big metropolis, where the working classes of all races get forced out by the high rents. You get this very high-end professional managerial elite, and then you get people who are directly or indirectly servants, basically, or service providers, right, who tend to be very poorly paid, no benefits, no unions, that sort of thing. So, I think you just can't understand what's going on without seeing this kind of three-way system where within you have these two classes within the big cities, London, Paris, New York, Austin, Minneapolis maybe, which is the high-end professionals, the managers, the managerial class, and people who are kind of doing Downton Abbey work for them in many cases, if you recognize the reference. Then out in the outer suburbs and the small towns, you get not only the older rural people, but you also get people who used to live in the cities but were driven out. So white working class. There's also African American working class, Latino working class, and others, and aspirational immigrants who see working in New York or LA as a temporary way station before they move out to the suburbs and their dollar goes farther and maybe they get paid a little more. I had an editor at the New York Times who kept complaining that her maids kept quitting and moving to Long Island. I thought, good for them.
So you think that the American system needs to be adjusted in light of this analysis, and what sorts of proposals do you make?
Well, I don't make any detailed proposals, partly because I think for political reasons, we're further away from having any kind of comprehensive legislation on immigration reform than we were 10 or 15 years ago. But
you have proposed things like we need to move in the direction of skills and consent
yeah,
for the
yeah, and here I'm
criteria
just
rather than-
I'm following actually Democratic Party tradition. President Carter and President Clinton both appointed immigration reform commissions. One was headed by Father Theodore Hesburgh, who was the head of Notre Dame, and that report came out in 1981. And then Barbara Jordan, first African American representative since Reconstruction from Texas, whom I knew slightly. My aunt helped her on her memoir, and she performed the wedding ceremony for my cousin. So she was the Jordan Commission, appointed by President Bill Clinton, came out with a report, and it seemed reasonable at the time. They said, by all means, we want to keep family unification. Bring over your parents. Bring over your children. But we have all these categories of siblings and cousins and these gradations, and that just leads to this kind of huge. It's called chain migration, which some people think is insulting, but it wasn't. Originally, it was an academic term, right? So you kind of limit it to immediate nuclear family. You emphasize skilled immigrants, right? Because of the thought that we're not creating a lot of well-paid jobs for unskilled people in advanced industrial society. And you have employer enforcement. Because if employers have to obey the law and hire citizens and legal permanent residents, that is green card workers, then the illegal immigration problem kind of dries up because there's no demand. And you don't need to fortify the border and build walls and do all of this. So this was the perspective of the labor wing of the Democratic Party in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, as you all know, things have changed in the days of abolish ICE, and the parties have flipped on immigration. So Senator Tom Cotton, conservative Republican from Arkansas, has a bill, I think it's called the RAISE Act. They all have to have these clever acronym names. I don't even know what the acronym means. It's essentially the Clinton-Jordan Commission recommendations. It's been universally denounced as xenophobic and nativistic and fascist and racist by Democrats now. You had a glimpse of the older Democratic party line when Ezra Klein, the editor of Vox, interviewed Bernie Sanders in 2016. And so Ezra So what do you think of the idea of just having open borders? And there's a YouTube video you can look up if you're interested. Bernie Sanders says, that's a terrible idea. That's a right-wing idea. That's the Koch brothers. That will drive down wages. And he says, we want to help raise wages in the rest of the world through development, but not by driving down wages in the US. So for you younger people, the liberal position for most of the 20th century was moderate restriction of immigration for labor reasons, create tight labor markets. All the way up until the 2000s, it was right-wing Republicans and libertarians who were against immigration enforcement, against workplace enforcement, because they wanted Milton Friedman, the greatest influence on conservative economic thinking, wanted open borders. And I promise I'll only do this once, but the quote, I can't memorize these things.
I know the feeling.
But so I have a quote from Milton Friedman, who, if you're not familiar with him, very influential libertarian economist. And much of what the free market conservatives do to this day in terms of policy goes back to his book, Capitalism and Freedom, published in 1962. So this is Professor Friedman. If you have a welfare state, if you have a state in which every resident is promised a certain minimal level of income or a minimum level of subsistence, regardless of whether he works or not, produces it or not, then free immigration is really an impossible thing. So Friedman's solution was to have open borders but get rid of the welfare state. Just abolish Social Security, the minimum wage, everything else, right? Paul Krugman, who's, I think is safe to say, as a liberal economist, is kind of the opposite of Milton Friedman. He agrees. In an op-ed he wrote a few years back, he said, because modern America is a welfare state, and, quote, low-skill immigrants don't pay enough taxes to cover the cost of the benefits they receive, unquote. Krugman concluded that, quote, the political threat that low-skill immigration poses to the welfare state is more serious than to its other consequences. So here you have both Milton Friedman and Paul Krugman agreeing that if you have a welfare state, you're going to restrict immigration somehow, because otherwise the voters will rebel. And if you look at the most generous Scandinavian welfare states, like the Swedish welfare state, historically they had very long residency requirements. You had to live in Sweden for decades before you qualified. And you had to have paid in through payroll taxes. And that's because the classic 20th century welfare state, maybe it will be different in the 21st century, the 22nd, it's essentially a deal by which the working class majority right now is paying other members of the working class majority who are retired or disabled or unemployed. And that assumes that this is kind of a closed club. I mean, you can admit members on whatever plan you want, but it's not anybody who joins the club instantly gets the benefits. There has to have been some kind of record. And a lot of Western countries have treaties, like Social Security tax treaties. Do you know about this? So they will count years spent in France by an American expatriate towards payments into Social Security when the American comes back to the U.S., who's been a citizen the whole time, and retires. So, and this is something I think particularly progressives nowadays, they tend to dismiss the fairness criticism of participation and eligibility for welfare state benefits. But it really is fundamental to the deal, not just in countries with stingy, miserly welfare states like the United States, but ones with very generous welfare states in Northern Europe. In fact, the Danes have the most draconian immigration laws now, as well as one of the most generous welfare states. And they've been requiring potential refugees to turn over any money they have, any jewelry, anything, while they're on probation to see if they qualify under laws of asylum, which seems kind of harsh to me. But that's an element of this debate. How does immigration interact with a welfare state?
your position, abstracting for the moment, from the issue of racism, let's just put that aside for a second. It sounds to me like Trump's position. Is that fair or an unfair characterization?
Well, I think Trump, he has made racist remarks, talking about shithole countries,
Right.
if I can quote our president, in Africa versus Norway. I mean, that's racist, you know. Now, the press, and I worked for the New Yorker, the New Republic, the Harper's Magazine, but the press is 99.9% liberal Democratic. I'm just telling you, basis of experience. There are no Republicans in the offices of the New Yorker or CNN or anywhere like that. Maybe in the business side. So there is a narrative where everything Trump says is fitted into the narrative that he's a deranged, neo-Nazi, which I think is going too far. But no, my position, I say, is the Barbara Jordan position.
But
and it's
extracting from the racism dimension, practically, what is the difference between your position?
Oh, there's a
and
huge
what-
difference. There's a
what
huge
is it?
difference between my position and Trump's, and that is the wall is kabuki theater, right? As we say in Washington, it's like this very elaborate Japanese drama where all this stuff is going on and not very much happens. If you've ever watched kabuki theater, I don't want to insult Japanese culture, but that's the political phrase. So, as I said, if the Republicans were serious about reducing illegal immigration, they would have universal e-verify. That is, and this is something that was proposed by the Jordan Commission and in a version by Hesburgh. You just fine or imprison employers who knowingly hire illegal immigrants, and the e-verify works to make sure that the social security numbers, and there's another number called an ITIN number for non-citizens, that this has not been stolen. There are 2 or 3 million Americans whose social security numbers have been stolen and are being used by illegal immigrants in the workforce now. I am one. I was surprised last spring. I got a letter from the IRS. It says your social security number has been stolen. It is being used by someone in the workplace in the United States. We cannot tell you who it is or where it is. It is your responsibility to contact the credit rating agencies to make sure your credit is not ruined. So I thought, okay, thank you, my government. So I contacted Experian, and they said, so I said, can you monitor this? And they said, no, you have to check back every 90 days to make sure your credit is not ruined by the Michael Lind, who is working at this very moment somewhere in the United States. Now, it is the odds are, I have no resentment towards this individual. It's probably an undocumented immigrant who's working in some terrible job for a suburban construction contractor or in a kitchen or something like that. These are exploited laborers, right? I want them to have a path to citizenship and become citizens and have rights and vote, okay? So, but the thing is, the media is not telling you the truth about this stuff. So when you have the phrase undocumented, you can't get a job in much of the United States if you don't have documents. They have fake documents or they have stolen documents, right? So how did this other Michael Lind, who's working probably for terrible wages and horrible conditions, get my social security number and my name and address and all of this? Well, these individuals are not adept at computer hacking, okay? Only international criminal gangs and certain foreign governments are capable of hacking the Social Security Administration's agencies. We know a couple of foreign states that have done this, right? So how does it get to the employer? Well, I happened to be told this by some illegal immigrants whom I knew working in Washington, D.C. There are places you can go where sometimes the employer gets it directly, sometimes the individuals, the workers get it. So the boss will say, okay, look, go to this lawyer, go to this store, pay a certain, a couple $100, and they give you an ITIN, they give you a social security number, like mine, right? Well, they got it from the mafia. They got it from transnational criminal gangs, which may have gotten it from state-supported foreign hacking, okay? One of the reasons I think there is this backlash, that fueled Trumpism, was essentially ever since the Reagan years, the federal government under both parties took a blasé attitude towards this, right? So it's true of George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. 3 million Americans had their Social Security numbers stolen. Maybe we'll notify them. I was surprised to be notified. They haven't done that until recently. But then they say, well, the Social Security Administration cannot tell the IRS, or and so on. So there's no communication. So right now, there's a court case. In one case, I think it's Kansas, maybe it's somewhere else. Can individuals sue, right? The government for not enforcing the law if their identity has been stolen. So that's why I do think there's a class element in this. That is, the elite Democrats and the elite Republicans think, okay, yeah, big deal. This is fine. We'll just live with this, right?
Yeah. But you do say that in the competition among the great powers internationally, the United States has to be concerned about productive capacity in that competition and developing innovation and productive capacity and that sort of thing. And you tie that in certain moments to a proposal on immigration, which is that we ought to be focused on those who can contribute to that productive capacity, and we need to move in a direction other than the one that we have currently embraced.
Yeah.
Isn't that fair?
Yeah, I think
And-
that we're in the early stages of Cold War II, where the major adversary is China. Russia is right now on the Chinese side, but could flip. But this is a long-term geopolitical and economic competition with China. And it's not like the competition with the Soviet Union in Cold War I. The Chinese are not spreading, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Xi Jinping thought. It's not an ideological competition. It's more like 19th century Europe versus France. It's great power competition, right? We're competing for markets, competing to dominate 5G, competing to dominate AI. It's largely economic. It's also diplomatic. There's a military element to it. And the strength of your manufacturing base and your scientific and technological base is critical to this. And we can't take it for granted the way we could in Cold War I. Because in Cold War I, the Soviet Union was essentially a third world country that was mostly frozen with nuclear weapons. And they had some very good native engineers, but a lot of the stuff they did, as we did, we got them from German rocket scientists after World War II. And thank God we got the good German rocket scientists, like Wernher von Braun, and they got the second tier ones. China has surpassed us in manufacturing capability already. It has surpassed us in GDP according to one measure, purchasing power parity. According to the other measure, market exchange rates, it will pass us by 2030. The United States, the whole time since the Civil War, we've been a great power. We've never been number two economically, and industrially. And we still have a lead over China in many areas. But I think this is going to concentrate our minds. And so I can tell you, it's leading to a rethinking in Washington among both progressives and conservatives of this kind of complacent attitude we had after the end of the Cold War, that we're number one, we're the unipolar superpower, we'll police the world forever. If people want to take manufacturing from us, fine. We have finance, we have Hollywood. In terms of immigration, there wasn't this sense that we are competing for talent, right, with the rest of the world, because we just thought we're so far ahead technologically that it will take ages for them to catch up. So I think we need to rethink this. I would.
That is Trump's position, is it not? I mean, that we need to be focused on that with respect to immigration. That is to say, bringing in people who can contribute to productive capacity and less concerned about the other kinds of rationales for admitting persons into the United States.
That's his position. It was also the position of Marco Rubio and Senator Schumer, in 2013, 2014, in comprehensive immigration reform, there have been 2 attempts, both failures for political reasons, at comprehensive immigration reform in this century. The first was in 2006 to 2007, and the second was in 2013, 2014. And they were both fairly sensible from my perspective, and they kind of followed the Hesburgh and the Jordan Commission approaches. You would keep family unification, but you would trim the cousins, somewhat, keep more nuclear family. You would greatly expand the skilled, have a point system, so that if you come here from Asia or Africa or the Middle East or Latin America, go to university, then you could get a green card without having to be bound to Infosys or Apple or whatever as an H-1B. There would be employer enforcement, E-Verify. They both, so it's just fairly, and you would have a path to citizenship, right, for most of the people who are already here, who are unauthorized. So it's a fairly sensible bipartisan approach. President Trump, with his proposal on DACA, on deferred action, for the children who came here when they're very young, that is essentially an amnesty, because what it would, in citizenship, because what it would do is, if you grant an amnesty for these people who came when they're very young but had been born abroad, because they can then bring in their relatives, they can retroactively get citizenship for their parents, right, who brought them here. So it's actually a de facto amnesty, and he seems quite sincere in his desire to do this for the wall. My problem with the wall is, I think this is a symbolic stunt. And he's a great showman, and I think that he promised this wall, and he will run in 2020 saying, I promise to defeat ISIS, I promise to do this, I promise to do that, and here's a picture of the wall, right, in Arizona or Texas or whatever. As I say, I don't think that's if you have employer enforcement, so the wall unites the Republican Party because it does not threaten the employers, right? If the president came out and said we need universal mandatory E-Verify for all businesses tomorrow, lots of landscapers, real estate developers, sweatshops, in the ag industry, they're going to fight back because their model is based on unauthorized, non-unionized, non-citizen labor. So that's where I will continue to insist on distinguishing my view from the president's.
Now might be a good time to entertain questions from the audience. If there are some, we would just ask that people speak into a microphone. First, raise your hand and speak into a microphone and pose the question. Keep your hand up to identify yourself.
Okay, so you mentioned that if, hypothetically, Trump mentioned that he wanted to make E-Verify something that was mandatory for all businesses. Do you believe that these businesses would fight back on that E-Verify, or would they push for legislation that would make it so that the workers would have an easier path to citizenship?
Well, so your classic employers, if you read Adam Smith, and he's always being cited by conservatives, he's a great champion of capitalism. He had a very low opinion of businessmen and merchants. He preferred farmers. He thought family farmers were the pillar of society. He really despised capitalists. And he has a great passage in The Wealth of Nations where he says that any employer given the option of a slave instead of a paid worker would take the slave, right? And it's not simply, he says, because it's cheaper. He says because in the human breast there's this lust for domination, this lust to lord it over people. And he attributes this to employers. So, and I think there was something very psychologically acute about that. Because if you look at H-1Bs, and some of my friends have been H-1Bs, they are really fairly well paid compared to the average American. I mean, some of them making six-figure salaries. They're doing tech work, they're doing professional work, but they live in fear, and they're willing to take abuses which citizen workers and legal permanent residents with green cards would, because they would quit. Right? The single biggest labor right is the right to quit your job and take another job without leaving the country, right? All guest worker programs bind you to one employer, the sponsor. And if you upset that employer, you have to go back home to your country, right? Now, they're nice employers who let you go work for somebody else, right? But to me, this is something that isn't discussed very much. In fact, one of my pet peeves is people discuss guest workers and call them immigrants. According to the federal government, guest workers, H-1Bs, J visas, H-2As in agriculture, are not immigrants. They are called non-immigrant visas. No matter how long you work in the United States, this does not start the clock ticking towards the 5 years to where if you have a green card, you become a citizen, right? So technically, these are not immigrants. They are contract workers who are foreign nationals. And the reason I'm raising this to answer your question is one of the reasons why the 2006 bill died and the 2014 bill died is because the Republicans, the Democrats agreed on everything else. The Republican employer lobby, which is much weaker now under Trump, because Trump has brought in more of a working class base than the old country club Republicans, it was very powerful under the Bushes. They said, well, if you take away illegal immigrant workers, you have to give us millions of new contract laborers every year. You can't force us to hire not only citizens and green card employees, but also the amnestied immigrants who are now citizens. They insisted that the Congress give them in compensation. They just need a workforce that can't vote and can't quit and can't unionize. So who objected to this? The private sector labor unions. So the AFL-CIO, the others, the bills, both bills collapsed because labor withdrew its support when the only way to pass it was to give the ag industry and the hotel industry these non-citizen guest workers forever, just endlessly, millions a year. So, you know, and that was the deal breaker. All the other stuff, the left, the right agreed on. But it was the insistence of the employers that you cannot ask us to hire people with basic labor rights and political rights. And that's what killed the deal.
Question here.
Hi, so I have a two-part question.
Sure.
Firstly, do you believe that there is either a role or a responsibility for an element of humanitarianism in American immigration policy, especially in light of the influence that America has had in shaping the world and many of the conflicts in the world, both through countries that America has intervened in or just general refugees? And secondly, if you do believe that there is a humanitarian role, but that the effects of that are offset by the detrimental effects that immigration has on the American workforce, don't you believe that the fact that we're dealing with a zero-sum game and that either way someone is going to be marginalized and exploited is indicative of a greater overall problem, and that the solution is something much greater and more inclusive than immigration reform? Thank you.
Yeah, as Professor Santuri said, I come out of what I consider the Rooseveltian tradition of liberal internationalism. The main way you help poor countries is not through immigration policy, because the United States has 4% of the world's population. And you're only going to be able, even with the most generous policy, you're not going to solve the problems of those countries by having people move here en masse. The problems of the post-colonial world that result from European imperialism, the parts of Mexico and Central America that the U.S. messed up with our imperialism, ultimately the test is to get these countries on a development path towards democracy, the rule of law, economics, and they're not going to develop economically by sending people to the U.S. or, for that matter, to the EU. So on the development side, I'm in favor of development. So what do you do that's positive? You invest in infrastructure in those countries, right? You penalize authoritarian regimes and anti-worker regimes if necessary. You have technological and commercial exchange. But you're not going to make any country prosperous by having people, particularly its most enterprising people, leave and come here. So the economic development thing, I think, is totally different from the refugee. The United States, since World War II, under the Genocide Convention and under various United Nations laws, under international law, we're bound to help refugees, who are genuinely in fear of extermination, right? We are not bound to help people who are poor, because most people in the world are much poorer than we are. There's a dispute right now over whether in these gang-ridden countries like Central America, fear of being killed by the mafia is like the same thing as being a Jew escaping Nazi Germany. There are arguments on both sides. On the other hand, given gang violence in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, I mean, if you're really going to take that, you should say that, well, people from Chicago should apply for amnesty in, Stockholm or somewhere. So I think that's a debatable case, but I can see the case for it. But here's the thing. Your classic refugee is reluctant. It's a reluctant refugee. They want to come home, right? They want to go back to their countries after the evil regime is overthrown, rebuild their lives, right? Now, there's some cases where it's so completely traumatic where you never want to go back if you're a Jew chased out of Nazi Germany. In the case of refugees from the Soviet Union, it lasted for 70 years, right? You sort of give up hope of ever going home again after a while. But I think, that's the thing. You have to distinguish the genuine refugees that these post-1945, they're called displaced persons after World War II. You have to distinguish that from the hundreds of millions of people who are poor people in war countries. And they want to move and get jobs. And excuse me, and I'm going to drink a little of this. To the U.S. or Canada or Western Europe. And they're not refugees in the classic sense. They're economic migrants.
So what do you say about the Central Americans?
The Central Americans, it's actually similar to the Syrian refugee problem in Europe, where under international law, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, the first safe country in which the refugee arrives has the obligation to house and clothe and feed them, right? Now, realistically, this does not happen, because if you're a refugee from a poor country and then the next door country is safe but is poor, right? You're better off if you keep going through multiple countries until you arrive in Germany, right? Or until you arrive in France or Britain or, the United States. But that, as I understand it, that is the rule, right? So if you're fleeing Honduras and it's safe, in Mexico, then Mexico is obliged to help you, right? They're not obliged to wave you on through to the U.S. border. Now, having said that, if we have people amassing at the U.S. border, as we do now, raise my taxes, right? Pay for beds, pay for humane treatment. We're a rich, decent society, okay? But at the end of the day, and this will be true even if the Democrats now are all running essentially saying nothing about any restrictions on immigration or any enforcement. It's just abolish ICE, ambiguous slogan. If you have President Warren or President Harris or President Sanders, that president is going to enforce immigration law. I mean, it's the law. You're commander-in-chief. President Obama enforced immigration law, right? So we will continue to have a system in which there's a specialized system of immigration courts where you go through the application, you apply for asylum, and the judges decide whether you merit it or not. And if you don't merit it, you don't get it. And that's true of all countries, right? There's some kind of decision-making process. So it should be generous. But on the other hand, it can't be indiscriminate, because what you're doing then, and it hurts the real I keep saying genuine refugees. There are lots of genuine refugees. You're getting people who claim persecution when they really just want a job or a better life in a first world country. But they're not in actual danger of being killed by a genocidal regime or maybe murdered by gangsters. It's like they want a better life, right? So for those people, you can say, well, increase the legal immigration quota if you want to admit more of them, more economic migrants. But they're economic migrants. They're not refugees. And this is not my distinction. I mean, this is international law as I understand it.
So what do you say to the libertarian type who says, well, let's go with open borders and just let the market sort it out?
Well, the libertarians are not fond of me because I wrote a widely cited article in Salon about a decade ago with the asking the question, why are there no libertarian countries? So if this whole open borders, no minimum wage, no welfare state system is such a great idea, you would think at least one country would have tried it, right? I mean, all other political systems, we have real world national examples, right? I mean, we still have Marxist-Leninist states, in North Korea and Cuba and China, right? They functioned, right? I mean, they functioned terribly. In the case of the Soviet Union and China, millions of people starved. Others died in prison camps. But, yeah, communist countries can work in a bad sort of tyrannical way. Fascist countries, if they'd not been defeated militarily, might survive to this day, right? They wouldn't have necessarily fallen apart. Why isn't like one... Now, I say that, having said that, libertarians periodically, about once a decade, they announce that they have founded a libertarian utopia on an abandoned and repurposed oil derrick, or in one case, like a sandbar in the middle of the Rio Grande River, separating Texas from, and there's this great flurry of news articles saying that, so the most recent example of this was about a decade ago, where Patry Friedman, the nephew of Milton Friedman, the economist, wrote an essay for the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, which I have many friends. I like libertarians. I just think they're crazy. He wrote this very intelligent essay. He said, look, Libertarian Party gets maybe 1 or 2% of the vote in the United States. It's true in other democracies. Let's face it, this nation-state democracy thing is bad for libertarians. They don't like us, these voters. So we'll form our own countries. So he created something called the Seastead Foundation, which was to raise money to buy abandoned oil derricks and turn them into sovereign countries that libertarians could move to. Now, they would be in places like San Francisco Bay. So I remarked on this, and I made the rather unkind suggestion that they should try it in the waters off of Somalia, haunted by pirates, to be a real test of their system, right? Not right off of Marin County and Berkeley. So, but this, I mean, look it up. It's the Seaside Foundation. I think they folded a few years ago. So does that answer your question?
It does, in some measure, yeah. Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
A lot of the points made have been on welfare, and a large body of research indicates that curtailment of welfare rights is unlikely to appreciably stem the flow of new migrants because the availability of social services or entitlements is not a powerful magnet for would-be unauthorized entrants as compared with other demand pull factors. So talking about welfare and talking about E-Verify and how you want to enforce it in a way, and it sounds like you may also, if you do enforce E-Verify, people will become unemployed, undocumented, unskilled workers, which you mentioned you did want a path to legalization.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You're absolutely right. There are proposals now and then to punish not only illegal immigrants but legal immigrants by denying them welfare. It's a terrible idea because the main pull factor's a job. It's employment, right? Now, I would not implement E-Verify without a amnesty and path to citizenship. So everyone who, if it goes into effect, January 1st, 2021, every unauthorized immigrant who, and then you have to sort out like criminals and so on. Most are otherwise law-abiding apart from, the legal documents or whatever. They would have instant legal status to remain in their jobs, right? Until they acquire citizenship, which I would grant as rapidly as possible, even though it's kind of unfair that you've jumped the line. I mean, it is unfair, right? Because people from the same countries have been, waiting for years or decades, and then somebody jumps the line and gets citizenship. Nevertheless, there's an overriding public purpose. And the overriding public purpose is everyone who works in a democracy should have identical rights, including the right to vote and the right to unionize, right? And the right to quit your employer. So I would not do E-Verify and then have 12 million people suddenly unemployed in a few cities in Texas and California and New York. It would have to be part of an amnesty system. So this is essentially telling the employers, right? You're not going to lose your workers that you presently have, but from now on, you just can't do this anymore, right? You can't use forged documents. You can't use stolen social security numbers. That we're shutting down what is essentially a transnational criminal mafia system of obtaining and selling people's identity. It's identity theft. It's international identity theft run by criminal organizations, right, in this hemisphere and in the old world. And we need to shut that down, right? But so I would not punish the workers. I would make them citizens at an expedited pace. As a matter of fact, in the New York Times about a decade ago, I published an op-ed proposing that we shrink the 5-year status, for the residency requirements. Right now, when you get a green card, it takes 5 years before you can apply for citizenship. And I suggested shrinking it to 2. I would get rid of it altogether, but I thought that's a bit too radical. By the way, do you know why there's this 5-year requirement? It all goes back to the Jefferson administration and the Adams administration. So when the French Revolution broke out, we had 2 parties in the United States, the Federalists, who were kind of the New England conservatives, and the Southern agrarians, the Jeffersonians, who were called the Republicans in those days. They later became the Democratic Republicans and then the Democrats. And so the biggest group of immigrants were Irish Catholics from Ireland, who tended to favor the French Revolution because the English hated it, and being Irish, whatever the English hated, they were for, right? So the Federalists were convinced that all these Irish immigrants were spies and agents of the Jacobins in revolutionary Paris. And so what had been, I think the original was 5 years, it was something like that, the residency requirement, they stretched it, I believe, to 14 years. I'd have to check. So basically, the Irish immigrant had to be under the observation of his or her neighbors for 14 years, just to make sure they weren't radical, subversive French Jacobin secret agents, right? So the Jeffersonians come in. Jefferson and Madison, as part of the Southern Party, they established the Southern alliance with the Irish American political machines in New York and other northeastern cities. As early as the Jefferson administration, Tammany Hall already existed. That was the Irish-dominated Democratic machine in New York City. So from their perspective, the more Irish voters, the better, right? So they shrank it to 2 years. And then eventually the 5 years was kind of a compromise. It makes no sense whatsoever, right? I mean, at this point, I'm not even sure why we do this. If you're going to give somebody a green card, and you should have done the due diligence as our government to make sure that they're not secret agents, right, or terrorists before. And if they are, how likely are they to tip their hand before they get the citizenship, right? So it's another case where in a lot of this, you just get historical inertia animating things.
So if we implement what I understand to be the Lind policy, then we restrict the influx of low-skill or low-wage immigrant labor, protecting American workers. So wages go up. So labor costs go up. What's your read on the economics of how many jobs then disappear? And is that ultimately a net gain for lower skilled natives, given what I take to be sort of conventional economic wisdom about the relationship between labor costs and jobs, unemployment rates, et cetera?
Well, the conventional wisdom, and you see this and usually it's the minimum wage, is kind of the proxy for these discussions, because you're raising the wage by a tight labor market, but it can be done by other measures. It can be done by a minimum wage law. And it creates transitional unemployment in some fields where the business model was based on the low-wage labor. So if your business depends on low-wage labor and the wage goes up for whatever reasons, it can be fewer low-wage immigrants, it can be a $15 minimum wage, it can be they're unionized, right? But the price of labor goes off. Then you have to look on a case-by-case basis. Is this something for which there is what economists call inelastic demand, right? So even if it costs more, people will still demand this. And if that's the case and you're an employer, you want to supply that demand. So you would try to do it in some labor-saving way. Either you would invest in robots or AI or software, or you would change your inefficient business model to be more efficient by retraining people. It doesn't have to be technology. It often is. And you see this argument where people say, well, if you raise the minimum wage, or alternately if you restrict low-wage immigration, this will lead people to have robots and automation. That's great. That's terrific, right? The dream of society, I think, should be that any work that can be done by a machine or a computer program should be done by machines. So yes, there's transitional unemployment. There was transitional unemployment when automobiles replaced horses, and when the jackhammer replaced John Henry, in the folk song with his individual hammer. There has never been mass technological unemployment in the entire history of the world since the Industrial Revolution began. And you're always seeing these scare stories about, the coming wave of mass unemployment because of robots and AI and all of this. Maybe it will happen. It's never happened before. There have been temporary industries. There's been some transitional unemployment. But so why has this not happened? Well, let me backtrack. All of the great economic crises, like the Great Recession and the Great Depression, and we had depressions in the 19th century that were even worse, they came out of financial panics. So if you're worried about mass unemployment, you have to be worried about banking failures, where you have runs on the banks and financial panics, and not any financial panic. So the studies have shown that the financial panics that cause depressions are the ones that affect real estate and mortgages, including farm mortgages in the old rural days, but residential mortgages now. You can have a stock market bubble like the one in 2001 that pops, and you recover from it quickly. It doesn't affect many people because the stock market is owned largely by rich people. Yeah, they lose some money. You don't get mass unemployment, mass wealth loss. 2008, 1929, it's when the contagion affects real estate and middle class and working class homeowners. That's what causes depressions and mass unemployment. Technological advance to date has not done so because you're lowering the price of the good or service through productivity, right, with the machine. So something that used to have a labor cost, now it's just, robots don't have high wages and need benefits and things like that. So the good or service is cheaper. So even people who are paid the same as they were before, and they can be working class people or poor people, they've got more discretionary income because the calculator, let's say, which cost like $80 in 1970, is $1.50 now. And they can spend that on other services, which we know from history tend to be labor-intensive quality of life services. As food gets cheaper, as manufactured goods get cheaper, as telecommunications gets cheaper, even people without high incomes have more discretionary spending, and they go on more vacations, and they go out, and they go shopping, and they have more recreation. And so if you look at the jobs that are being created right now in the US and in Europe, it's exactly what you would expect to see as a result of productivity growth in an advanced technological economy. They're mostly personal face-to-face service jobs in quality of life industries like healthcare, recreation, restaurants, where you could live without it, but you have a little spending money, right? You go out to eat, right? Spend a little more on healthcare. So I'm not worried about that at all.
But why, if I may,
Yeah.
just to follow, why aren't low-skilled or low-wage immigrants just function? Why aren't low-wage immigrants just functioning like the robots in the present regime, right? So they make everything cost less, and then everybody else has more money to spend. So actually, working-class Americans are benefiting from it, right? Wouldn't the robots be interchangeable with the low-skill immigrants in terms of their function in the economy, which is just to lower the cost of production?
Yes, they would if you are Jefferson Davis, or if you are the Sultan of Dubai, right? I mean, I'm a Southerner myself. We tried this experiment for 400 years of having, I like to say, workers who can't vote employed by voters who don't work, all right? This experiment did not end happily. So, to me, it's just, if you're going to have a democratic republic, it has to be based on what Aristotle and the Greeks called isonomia, one law for all. You cannot have a caste of ethnically different people or people of different nationality who are a permanent working class, who have no realistic prospects for advancement. Otherwise, you end up, as I said, Dubai. If you look at Dubai, Saudi Arabia, they have this native elite. They have the natives who have this very generous welfare state and so on. And then much of the work is done by imported, often indentured servants from the Philippines and so on. So from a purely economic point of view, well, yeah. But on the other hand, if you're looking at this solely from an economic point of view, you can also lower prices by abolishing the minimum wage, or by making people work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, the way they did in 1900. So, I think it's ultimately gets down to political philosophy, what a democratic republic is.
But I mean and I'll stop, I promise. But I mean that argument focuses on the good of the immigrants, whereas your lovely essay, which we read in my class, I thought the argument was about the benefit of native workers who were disenfranchised by the managerial class. So the argument you're making now, I understand to be different. It's basically an objection to a kind of permanent subclass, but it's not about the effects on native workers per se.
No, just to make it clear, I expect and support continued immigration to the U.S. and Western societies of some kind. I want those immigrants, once they get here, to join the prosperous working class as quickly as possible, right? So now any regime you have where you restrict the numbers compared to what it is now, there will be people in foreign countries who would have come here who do not, right? So there are people who use cosmopolitan ethical theory saying that you have to put the interest of the foreign national who wants to move to the US or Germany or Canada and treat them the same as the citizen who's already here. So yeah, I mean, in a nation state, you put the interest of your nation state citizens first. But on the other hand, I think if it's going to be a democratic nation state, you do not want to have a segmented labor force of any kind, right? So having indentured servants, you don't want to have people bound to employers. Anyone who works in the United States should have the right to quit. I would get rid of H-1Bs, H-2As, JV, all of that stuff, and give people green cards, right? If you're qualified to work in the U.S., you get a green card, or, and you're a potential citizen. And historically, this was the progressive liberal tradition. Its enemies were indentured servitude. Now, there was a racial element to this with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but the Asian workers who were not immigrants. They were contract labor who were being brought here, most of them. So they went after contract labor, the unions and the left and the progressives. They went after prison labor, which in my part of the country in the South was a terrible exploitative thing, where essentially the prison warrens rented out the prisoners to northern corporations that owned the plantations and the timber farms and the cotton farms, child labor. So the ultimate vision is one where all workers in the country have identical rights and identical bargaining power, identical leverage against our class. Because let's face it, the college-educated professional class, we kind of have a buyer's market in low-wage labor now, right? And immigration is part of this. I read recently that only 5% of employers of nannies in the United States obey the laws that govern nannies. That is, who pay their social. If you have a nanny, you're supposed to pay the Social Security taxes to the IRS. You have to obey wages and hours laws. You have to obey overtime laws. Nobody does. Nobody does. It's an incredibly exploitative system of mostly foreign-born women. And I think this is just outrageous. And who does it? It's people like me, right? I mean, I'm not married and I don't have kids, but it's the professional upper middle class, right, who have this system of labor exploitation, and it's invisible in the media because everybody's doing it, right? So, the question is what kind of society we're going to be. It should be a society in which all employers, including employers of household servants, are bound to exactly the same labor law regime that giant corporations are. And this is why, getting back to what we started with the managerial professional class, we have exempted ourselves, right, from this labor law regime. So sanctuary cities, Austin is a sanctuary city. This is portrayed as a great idealistic thing, and it is in some ways. I mean, there's some altruistic elements to it. But, I mean, come on. It also means that the mostly white, mostly native, upper middle class professionals who employ nannies and pay them off the books, and gardeners and other people, don't have to obey the Social Security rules. They don't have to obey employment laws, right? So they're kind of protecting their own exploited labor force. And this is where I differ from Trump and Trumpism, if you want to call it that. Basically, what the president has done and the right is it's kind of played by the Buchanan playbook, the paleo-conservative playbook, right? These folks are a threat to our culture. They're criminals. That's all nonsense. Latino immigrants are no more violent than natives, if you look at the statistics, right? So playing up the crime all the time and all of this on right-wing websites, totally misleading. If you look at assimilation in terms of acquiring English, of intermarriage, various other indices, Latin American immigrants assimilated exactly the same rate as the Irish and the Poles and the Germans and the Swedes and Norwegians did in the past, right? So to me, this is largely an economic issue, but economic and political, in as much as if you want to have a working class with bargaining power vis-a-vis employers, including individual households, they got to have leverage, and they don't have workers, immigrant workers, native workers, they lack leverage nowadays.
I think we have time for one more question, perhaps. There's one here.
In response to one of your earlier questions, you seemed very in support of foreign development and foreign trade. Yet at the beginning, you heavily emphasized the need to protect American manufacturing in what you see as leading up to the Second Cold War. So to me, that seems somewhat, those ideas don't necessarily line up with the idea of comparative advantage, where if it's cheaper for us to trade with these other countries to help them develop and then also lower the costs of products in the US, that would be the right choice, whereas at the same time, that would be taken away from American manufacturing. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah, my answer, I'm not a PhD economist. I've studied a lot of this stuff. I'm lecturing to Danny Roderick's Harvard class, his Harvard economics class next month. But my background's a historian. Ignore everything your econ professors teach you about David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, because it's a wonderful little thought experiment. This is about whether essentially, if you can do one activity better, you can do two activities better than somebody else, but you do one activity really better, then you should let somebody else do the activity that you can do better, but not as well, not that much betterer, right? To use the superlative. It makes no sense to base the industrial commercial policy of even a tiny nation state like Luxembourg on the thought experiment of a 19th century economist who's an incredibly brilliant figure. But it's a thought experiment, all right? I have searched for years. I have asked eminent economists, maybe someone here can tell me, where are the studies that prove that David Ricardo was right about comparative advantage? So where, like German-Polish trade, British trade with Chile, I mean, where are the historical case studies? There are none. Literally, they are teaching you a thought experiment that has never been tested in the real world of the economy. Now, so if you look at actual historical economics, which was the name of a school, it was called the American School of Economics in the 19th century. It was inspired by Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln was part of it. And it was spread to Europe by a German economist named Friedrich List. And around 1900, it was called the German Historical School. Came back to the US and was known as institutional economics. And it was driven off of the university campuses after 1945 and replaced by neoclassical economics and Marxist to some extent. But according to this, historical school, institutional school, whatever you want to call it, you can do any industry anywhere, any modern industry. You make cars anywhere, right? The problem is the country that is the first one to have like a steel industry or an automobile industry, the barriers to entry, even in free trade, are so huge because let's say if you're 19th century America, you're completely agrarian and you want to catch up with the first industrial superpower, Britain. It's just really hard to break in, right? Because the British have these mills, right? And they have cotton mills and they're machine powered. And it takes a long time to build up your capacity. So you have infant industry tariffs. You have various kinds of protectionism until you catch up. Now in this classical historical theory, it's not protectionist as such. Once you catch up, then you liberalize. But you don't liberalize for the David Ricardo comparative advantage. You liberalize because it's in the interest of both parties to have the biggest integrated market for industries with increasing returns to scale, like manufacturing. Now, unlike Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which I keep poking fun at, this theory has been tested and it's correct. So one of the things that neoclassical economists can't explain is why is it that most advanced industrial nations import and export goods in the same industry, right? Because they shouldn't, right? So the US sells cars to Germany and imports cars to Germany. We sell consumer electronics to Japan and South Korea, and they import from Japan. And sometimes it's different levels in the supply chain, but often it's like cars, right? You can get BMWs and Fords and things like that. Well, the answer is what shapes the pattern, the actual pattern of distribution of industry is the level of income and the preferences of the consumers. So most trade, this is very important, most trade in the world is among rich industrial countries, right? It's within the triangle of Northeast Asia, North America, and Europe, and it's largely trade in the same goods, which tend to be advanced manufacturing. So that's perfectly fine. And if you look at the European Union and the United States, we have pretty balanced trade. The Germans have the kind of mercantilism, but it's pretty balanced. Japan, East Asia, there's always been a problem because the Japanese and South Koreans have protected their home markets by various non-tariff barriers while having free access to ours. But it was something we live with. China, when you have, as I say, what will soon be the world's largest economy, where its major industrial corporations are state-owned enterprises, where the government will spend whatever it takes so that they don't go bankrupt, right? And they target your industries and are engaged in dumping, which is something that classical economics is totally right about. Dumping is when you're selling below the cost of the product temporarily in order to destroy your rival. And then you know once your rival is driven out of business, you can then jack up your price, right? And you have a monopoly of that field. So when you're dealing with what was called mercantilist countries, like the People's Republic of China, it's not free trade, right? Because it's not a level playing field. Now, if it were, and this is what the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, Obama, finally, they kind of gave up. They were hoping that China would become a more or less liberal economy, right? Like the Europeans or even the Japanese are somewhat liberal. And their big companies would be real companies. They'd be capitalist enterprises, not state-owned corporations. Hasn't happened. It's been going the other way. So am I contradicting myself? No, because most of the growth in the future export markets for the U.S. and other industrial nations that it pays to be part of are not in China proper. It's in India and Africa and the developing countries of Latin America and the Middle East. So most of the growth of the global middle class in this century is going to take place outside of Europe and outside of North America. And it is important for us to have manufacturing, not because these are good jobs. I mean, that's kind of the Trump thing, right? It's like blue-collar worker, you take your lunch pail, good, well-paid factory job. You know, that's not my view. My view is there are going to be between 500 million and 1 billion people added to the population of Africa in this century. Now, this is a good thing. If at the same time you have falling birth rates, increasing education, you're going to have this growing African middle class, right? There's a growing Indian middle class. You have billions and billions of people joining this gradually growing global middle class. And we want people in Northfield, Minnesota, you know, selling to those foreign markets. And what do they sell? They sell manufactured goods that you can put on a truck and ship, and then put on a container ship and ship abroad. Or they sell high-end services in some cases. So I think, you know, this whole protectionism versus free trade thing, it's what you actually want is something like what the Europeans have achieved, where you have a pooled market. The EU was originally called the common market. I've always been in favor of a transatlantic free trade area, where we pool our economy with that of the Europeans. And as long as we're not cheating against the French and the Germans are not putting a hand on the scale behind BMW, then that's great. You have this huge middle class. That's kind of a long-winded way of beating up on David Ricardo, who he was wrong about comparative advantage. He was right about the landlords. He thought in the long run the landlords would destroy capitalism. So if you're interested in Ricardo, check that out.
I think we'll end with that challenge to neoclassical economics. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. Good night.